Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
This morning we're going to study Psalm 126. In Psalm 126, we're looking at two eras of time. Verses 1 through 3 deal with the past. These events took place on the world stage. They're international. And verse 2 is the confession of the nations, and verse 3 is the confession of the Jewish community. And then verses 4 through 6 deal with the future. It's a time of restoration, and this is a desired future. It's a future they're looking forward to, something they are looking forward to, that the Jewish community is looking forward to. All right. This is another psalm of the Songs of Lament, Psalms of Ascent. I'm sorry, having trouble with this. This is another psalm in the Songs of Ascents. I can just hear them singing while looking back into this period of their lives and looking forward to restoration. Remember, the Songs of Ascents are sung during the annual pilgrimage to Jerusalem in satisfaction of the requirements set forth in Deuteronomy 16:16. The outline of the chapter looks something like this. Verses 1 through 3 is remembering Yahweh's return to Zion, and verses 4 through 6 is petition or request for God's work and restoration. So, let's look at verse 1. Psalm 126, verse 1. When the Lord restored the fortunes of Zion, we were like those who dreamed. All right, I'll just tell you right away, we get into a position of great debate among scholars. Should the Lord restore, I'm looking at the NIV, should the Lord restore the futures of Zion be better translated as the Lord brought back the captives to Zion? So those in English don't look anywhere near the same. The translations using the word restored are the NIV, the Berean Bible, the CSB, and the HCSB. Those are some pretty big names. The ones using the captives, the Lord brought back the captives to Zion, are the New American Standard, the King James, the New King James, the CEV, the GNT, sort of the GNT. I gave them credit for that one, and the ISV. So you see, it's not cut and dried. There are some pretty big names using both different translations. So let's see what, if any, are the similarities between the two. First of all, the pilgrims are looking back and remembering when Yahweh returned to Zion, to Jerusalem. Remember in Ezekiel, prophecies about Jerusalem, Ezekiel prophesied about Jerusalem and its fall to Babylon in 586 BC. As part of their prophecy, he reported on the glory of the Lord vacating the temple in Ezekiel 10. It's hard to think about that, but God left their temple. And that's talked about in Ezekiel 10. Judah was taken captive by Babylon and held captive for 70 years. The Medo-Persians then defeated Babylon, and they released the Jews to return to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple and so on and so forth. That's reported in Nehemiah and Ezra. This rebuilding of the temple is when the return of Yahweh occurs. If he left somewhere in the Bible, it's got to talk about his return. And that return occurred when they were released by the Medo-Persians to go back to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple. When the Jews were released to return, they were only released to return. they were still captives or at least under supervision by the Medo-Persians. Furthermore, they would always be living under somebody's thumb until 1948. And that includes the Greeks under Alexander the Great and the Romans. That was after the Medo-Persians. So even when they got out from under the Medo-Persians, they were still captives to somebody, the Greeks or the Romans, and it even goes further than that. So when they were recognized as a nation in 1948, they were restored somewhat to their land. All right. So remember, we're talking about, do we use the word restored or do we use captives? They've always been captives, at least up until 1948. All of that is background. So let's get back to chapter 126, verse 1 in Psalms. When they returned to Jerusalem, they were captives. But at the same time, God was restoring their fortunes, just like it said right there, when the Lord restored the fortunes of Zion. So when they returned to Jerusalem, they were captives, but at the same time they were being restored to their fortunes, somewhat because they would have Jerusalem. That's the way it looks like they were under some kind of restoration, because they were getting Jerusalem back and they were getting the temple to be built again. Okay, now there are two Hebrew words. I'm telling you all this because I don't know which version of the Bible you're using, which translation you're using. If you're using the NIV or one of those that I already read that uses restoration, you get one idea of what's going on. If you read the King James, the New American Standard, you feel like something else is going on. One is talking about restoration and one is talking about captives. So I'm going through this to kind of give you some background for your enlightenment and your understanding about what the Bible is really saying here. Okay, there are two Hebrew words. We're not going to go into what they are, but they seem to indicate that restoration is involved. Two Hebrew words in verse 1 indicate that restoration is involved. So I choose to believe that it is probably a little bit of captivity, because they are still captives, but their fortunes are somewhat restored, and they are moving back to Jerusalem and their temple to rebuild their temple. So you've got restoration working, and you've got captivity, being in captivity working. So I further believe that we could tell, if we could talk to the people of the time, they would say the same thing. There's a little bit of captivity and a little bit of restoration. So there's a little bit of captivity and a little bit of restoration involved. So let's let's see what's going on in the rest of verse 1. The last part of verse 1 says, "We were like those who dreamed. When the Lord restored the fortunes of Zion, we were like those who dreamed." We were like those who dreamed. When one dreams, he escapes from reality. Either he goes to a better place, which by definition would be an escape from reality because it's better than his current reality, or he goes to a worse place, a place which would be a place we would like to redesign or change if we could. Either case is outside of reality. When you dream, you're outside of reality. Things are either better than reality or they are worse than reality. I'm sure that when they were told they could return to Jerusalem, they were excited. They were coming out of 70 years of captivity, and the Medo-Persians say you can go back to Jerusalem. I'm sure they were excited, but most did not return. Their lives after 70 years of captivity under Babylon were set. They did not desire further change. Nevertheless, they would all be like those who dreamed. That's what this verse says. They were like dreamers. They would enter into a state of hope for things to be like they used to be, meaning before Babylon, when things were good. They lived in Jerusalem. The streets were clean and everything was good. So let's look at verse 2. Verse 2 says this, when the Lord restored the our mouths were filled with laughter, our tongues with songs of joy. That's verse 2a. Let's stop right there. Our mouths were filled with laughter, our tongues were with songs of joy. So now let's look at verse 1 into verse 2a. When the Lord restored the fortunes of Zion, we were like those who dreamed. Our mouths were filled with laughter, our tongues with songs of joy. That laughter, meaning happiness and security, and songs of joy would be the order of the day. That's what they're dreaming about. When they were told to go back, that's what they're dreaming about. While all of this would not be what they had longed or hoped for, there would be a realization that Yahweh's work of restoration was still underway. I know in their hearts they knew it wasn't going to be like it used to be, but they were dreaming in their minds that it would be, and that was their hope. This very truth is found all through Isaiah 40, chapters 40 through 55, and Jeremiah chapters 30 to 33. It's too much to read, but Isaiah 51:11 says this. Let me read Isaiah 51:11. Okay, Isaiah 51:11. Those the Lord has rescued will return. They will enter Zion with singing. Everlasting joy will crown their heads. Gladness and joy will overtake them, and sorrow and sighing will flee away. Clearly, this says that when they can, they will return. And when they can, they will return, and there will be with singing and joy, that sort of thing. That is the kind of things that we see all through the prophecies of the Old Testament about the return from Babylon or return from captivity, wherever that captivity is. Okay, now let's look at the last part of verse 2 in Psalm 126. It says, then it was said among the nations, the Lord has done great things for them. All right, I want to read verse 1 into verse 2, and then we'll look at the last part of verse 2 again. When the Lord restored the fortunes of Zion, we were like those who dreamed. Our mouths were filled with laughter, our tongues with songs of joy. Then it was said among the nations, the Lord has done great things for them. So their great hope, all through prophecies of the Bible, is that when God restores them, it's going to be to this situation where there's happiness and security and songs of joy and that sort of thing. That may not be till later, but nevertheless, remember the first 3 verses are looking back into the past when they were restored the first time, and even then the nations, meaning Babylon, all the nations of the world that could see what's going on with them, recognized that God was in the process of doing great things for them. The nations, verse 2b said, then it was said among the nations, the Lord, this is their confession, the Lord has done great things for them, the Jewish community. The nations, Babylon and the like, had mocked them during times of war with comments like, where is your God now? And that sort of thing. But those comments have turned to a recognition of what their God Yahweh has done for them. There's a recognition, and it's an outward confession now that there's a recognition of what God has done for them. Their comment was, the Lord has done great things for them, the Jews. Sooner or later, all of the nations will bow before Yahweh. Look at Isaiah 49, verse 23. Just a page back from Isaiah 51. Isaiah 49, verse 23. It's an interesting verse because it's the forerunner to stuff we've seen over in Philippians about sooner or later, everyone will bow to the name of Jesus. Listen to Isaiah 49, verse 23. Kings will be your foster fathers, and their queens your nursing mothers. They will bow down before you with their faces to the ground. They will lick the dust at your feet. Then you will know that I am the Lord. Those who hope in me will not be disappointed. They will know that I am the Lord. Things are going to be done, like this confession of the nations about the great things that God has done for them. They're going to be done in such a way they're going to know that it was God that did it. We've talked about things like that before. Then you will know that I am the Lord. All right. So let's look at verse 3. Psalm 126, verse 3. The Lord has done great things for us, and we are filled with joy. Now, the confession of the Jews. The Lord has done great things for us. Their restoration was not exactly what they were hoping for. It was not complete. But there is this confession, this recognition that the Lord has done great things for us. The final phrase of verse 3 is written so as to apply to the past. It says, we are filled with joy. Now, it's another one of those things, depending on what translation you're looking at, you're going to see something, you may see something different. The Berean, the ESV, the NIV, the King James, and the New American Standard say, we are filled with joy. If you look at the GNT, the CSB, the HCSB, or the ISV, it says we were filled with joy. Now, I just want to explain to you what the difference of those two are. It's just a matter of perspective. If you are looking at the translation that says we are filled with joy, we're in a section here of the past. And it says we would say then that we are filled with joy as we look back to what happened. We're talking about the past. They're singing now. They're saying we are filled with joy at what we see as we look back. So we're looking back into the past and we're filled with joy. If you have the translation that says we were filled with joy, we would say we were filled with joy when it happened. So it's all a look back. It's just a matter of opinion as to the translation, the way the translators chose to put that down. But it's both versions are a look back into the past, and it's either we're filled with joy when it happened or we're filled with joy when we think about what happened. Either way. So now we're going to enter into the future part of Psalm 126, and that's verses 4 through 6. So let's read verse 4. Now remember, this is one of the psalms that's being sung. It's one of the times when they're going up the mountain, going up to Jerusalem on their annual pilgrimage, and they're praising God for the things he's done, the laments they've gone through, and all those sorts of things. And that's what they're doing here. They're singing their praise to God. So verse 4 says this, restore our fortunes, Lord, like streams in the Negev. Okay, this is the part, now we're getting to the part, these three verses, 4, 5, and 6, are looking to the future. And this is a petition to restore our fortunes. In verse 1 it said, when the Lord restored our fortunes. Now they're saying, restore our fortunes. So we got one level of restoration that we're looking back to in the past. Now we're looking forward, and we're hoping for something a little more complete. So verse 4 said, restore our fortunes, Lord, like the streams in the Negev. Okay, so this is clearly looking to the future. We are talking about separate times in the life of the Jews, and we are talking about separate fortunes. And the fortunes, we're not talking about necessarily about money and houses and wealth. We're talking about their lifestyle, the way they can live with happiness and joy and peace and security, that sort of thing. Those are all considered fortunes. That's the kind of things we're talking about. They received great things, great fortunes from Yahweh, as confessed by the nations in verse 2, but clearly the past restoration was not complete. They got to go back to Jerusalem to rebuild the city. They got to go back to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple and the walls and all of that stuff that went with it. So they had to be excited and happy about that, but they were going back as captives. So their restoration is not complete by any means, and as I told you already, they stayed that way well into the end of the Roman domination of the world and other nations even after that. So the restoration of fortunes in verse 4 is to be complete and even more glorious than they were expecting. We're going to see that if you studied all the prophecies of the Bible, you would see what they should be expecting. They were requesting the restoration be sudden, like the flooding of the Negev. All right, let's talk about that a minute. Sudden, that's a pretty good word. We're talking about restoration. It doesn't sound like you got to wait once it gets started. The Negev is a normally dry area way south of Jerusalem. It's a big area. It's not a desert. It's just dry. When you're out of the rainy season, it's just dry. Okay, it's even south of the Dead Sea, but sudden winter rains cause the normally dry area to come to life with water. We've got all these ruts in the land. It looks like carved out ruts that become rain-swollen creeks in the rainy season, and that's what it's talking about in the Negev. When they get the winter rains, all of this area just becomes wet. It just gets lots of water. They're looking for a restoration of fortunes in the same manner. Like the winter rains come suddenly, they're asking for their fortunes to be restored suddenly in that manner. If they only knew what God has in store for them with a return to Eden-like conditions. This is one of the most incredible things I think we've ever read when we studied Ezekiel. Let's get over to Ezekiel 47. This is part of their complete restoration that they're hoping for. They've heard about it. They've studied the scriptures and the prophecies of Ezekiel, so they know about it, and that's what they thought they were going to be getting, I think, when they went back to Jerusalem. But they're still captives, so they don't have this yet. They're hoping for it. They're asking for it now in verse 4. So let's look at Ezekiel 47. It's verses 1 through 12, but I want to read verses 1 and 2 to you. The man brought me back to the entrance to the temple, and I saw water coming out under the threshold of the temple toward the east, for the temple faced east. The water was coming down from under the south side of the temple, south of the altar. He then brought me out through the north gate and led me around the outside to the outer gate facing east, and the water was trickling from the south side. So all those words are saying we've had chapters and chapters and chapters before chapter 47 Ezekiel talking about the millennial temple. It's the temple, I believe it's talking about that. It's the temple that they will be worshiping in after the second coming of Christ. These first two verses are talking about a vision that Ezekiel is having of what's going to happen. There's going to be water running out from under the temple. And here in the first two verses, it says it's a trickle. It's just a trickle. If you go down to verse 3, I'm not going to read it, but it says you go just a little ways and it's ankle deep. Then you look at verse 4 and it's knee deep. You go to verse 5 and it says it's deep enough to swim in and too fast and deep to cross. So this is all water that started with a trickle from the temple, and it becomes this torrent of water, okay, that's flowing down the mountain to the, we're going to see that it flows to the Dead Sea. Remember, the Dead Sea is dead. It's got a name called dead for a reason. It's because it's got some minerals in it, nothing will grow. All right, I want to make this brief interruption to this video on Psalm 126, but some way or another, when we created this video, I completely skipped over a section of my notes, and it's a part of Ezekiel 47. I'm intended to read verses 8 through 12 out of chapter 47. And I want to do that now because it's an important part. We were talking about restoration, the complete restoration that the Jews will receive at the second coming of Jesus. And so I just want to read it because it's such an important part. I'd been talking about how incredible this prophecy was, and all I talked about was the water that started with a trickle, and it gradually got to a point where it was too deep to swim and too fast to cross. So I want to just take a minute here and just make a brief comment. I'm probably not even going to read all the scripture, but it's going to be found in verses 8 through 12 of chapter 47. So the river was too deep to swim across, and no one could cross it. And then you get to verse 8. And in verse 8, I'm not going to read it, but in verse 8 it says, when it empties into the sea, the salty water there becomes fresh. And in verse 9, swarms of living creatures will live wherever the river flows. Then you get down to verse 10, and it says, fishermen will stand along the shore from En-gedi to En-eglaim. There will be places for spreading nets. The fish will be of many kinds, like the fish of the Mediterranean Sea. Then you get to verse 12, and it says, fruit trees of all kinds will grow on both banks of the river. Now remember what I told you earlier was this restoration is going to be to Eden-like conditions, and that's kind of what this is sounding like. It says their leaves will not, fruit trees, in verse 12, fruit trees of all kinds will grow on both banks of the river. Their leaves will not wither, nor will their fruit fail. Then the final verse final phrase of chapter 47, verse 12 is, their fruit will serve for food, and their leaves for healing. So that sounds like a pretty nice restoration for them. So please forgive my interruption, and it will continue to your current programming. Thank you. But this is future. That is future. That is restoration. That will occur upon their acceptance of Jesus as their Messiah on his return. Remember, they rejected Jesus as Messiah when he was here the first time. When he returns, they will accept him, and when that acceptance occurs, all of this restoration is going to occur. It's going to be complete, and it's going to be perfect. If we looked at Joel, I'll just read it to you. You don't need to find it. We look at Joel 2, verses 18 and 19, it says, "Then the Lord was jealous for his land and took pity on his people. The Lord replied to them, I am sending you grain." This is prophecy. "I'm sending you grain, new wine, and olive oil, enough to satisfy you fully. Never again will I make you an object of scorn to the nations." Okay, and then go to verse 23 and 24. "Never again will I make you an object of scorn for the nations." This is permanent. All right, verses 23 and 24. "Be glad, people of Zion. Rejoice in the Lord your God, for he has given you the autumn rains because he is faithful." These are metaphors now. "He sends you abundant showers, both autumn and spring rains as before. The threshing floors will be filled with grain. The vats will overflow with new wine and oil." We're talking about restoration, agricultural restoration. We're talking about, remember I told you the restoration we're talking about, restoration of fortunes, is more than just money and material things. It's everything they had before and more. And this is one of the things they're going to be getting, is they're going to agricultural independence and wealth back. Then you jump down to chapter 3, verses 1 and 2, and it says this: "In those days and at that time, when I restore the fortunes of Judah and Jerusalem, I will gather all nations and bring them down to the valley of Jehoshaphat. There I will put them on trial for what they did to my inheritance, my people Israel, because they scattered my people among the nations and divided up my land." That's Armageddon. These are the promises of God. This is the restoration. What they were looking for, you remember we talked about when Jesus was walking the earth, when he was in Jerusalem. They thought as Messiah, he was going to be their political king, and he was going to restore them to freedom and take them out from under the captivity of the Romans. That isn't what happened. That doesn't happen until now, until the second coming. All right, let's look at verse 5. Go back to Psalm 126, verse 5. "Those who sow with tears will reap with songs of joy." This is the future. Verses 4, 5, and 6 are the era of the future and the restoration of their fortunes in the future. Verse 5 says, "Those who sow with tears will reap with songs of joy." Here we see agricultural metaphors. The sowing and the planting will be done with tears. What we can say here is that what began with weeping at the time of planting will end with rejoicing at harvest. It's just a metaphor for the time of all the sadness and the problems they had when they were going through the time of planting, which was the time when they're waiting on this perfect restoration, when they're under captivity. That's what we're talking about. When that sadness occurs, all of that is going to end with total happiness and joy at the time of restoration, which is at the time of harvest, which is going to be metaphorically representative of this time of perfect restoration. All right, then we'll look at verse 6, and that'll be the end of our study. But verse 6 today says, "Those who go out weeping carry seed to sow." "Those who go out weeping, carrying seed to sow, will return with songs of joy, carrying sheaves with them." It's the same thing we're talking about in verse 5, where sorrow was associated with planting and joy was associated with reaping and harvesting. Here it says the same thing. Those who go out weeping, carrying the seed, that's the time of sowing and planting. It's a time of weeping. And it's metaphorically speaking, it's the time when they're in captivity and not in a status of having been restored. They're still under captivity. That's the time associated with weeping. They will return with songs of joy, carrying sheaves with them, which is a time of harvest. That's a time associated with the full restoration that God has planned for them. So this is a continuation of the blessing of verse 5, and I want to read a quote to you from the NIV commentary. Here's what he says about this verse. God will come and restore fortunes of his people such that a present moment defined by barrenness and sorrow will be transformed into a future filled with shouts of joy and arms full with the harvest. All right. That's all I have for you today. Thank you for listening.
Thank you.